Welcome to this week's Wisdom Wednesdays. And today we're going to talk about the mind. So it's called the Frenemy within, how to tame the mind before it devours you. And there's a few different aspects of this. One, the definition of frenemy. It's a combination of friend and enemy. So it's like that good pal that's always around you, that always talks about you when you're looking the other way in not so nice ways, but then smiles to your face. So there's a lot of two-faced or duality there. And I want to start that off just making the case with a little bit of an exercise. So I'm going to ask you to either open up Notepad on your computers or some kind of typing device, whatever it might be. And I'm going to show you a video, and I want you to just write down little snippets of whatever thoughts come to your mind during the course of this video. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Give me a minute while I share my screen.
Vedant is also there.
Oh, nice to see you, Vedant.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Okay. Oh, 1 second. I just have to fix something. Share computer sound. All right, you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So again, just write down whatever is coming to your mind, no matter how seemingly random it might be, okay?
There is no audio, right?
All right. We'll stop that for now. Action-packed thriller. Award nominee. So just curious, what were some thoughts that went through your head while watching that video?
I feel okay.
No, go ahead, Mataji.
Okay. I feel like he's back of the mind is thinking something.
So what did you write down? Where did your, like, if you wouldn't mind just reading your list.
In deep thoughts.
You were thinking deep thoughts?
Yeah.
Oh, like what?
Like sometimes even I will be in my thoughts and like then I will just stare at something that kind.
Okay. What about you, Vedant? It sounded like you were eager to share something.
Yeah, the first time I saw him, I thought something happened to him. He's very sad. So he's thinking about something. And later on, as video progressed, it came to mind that he might be watching some another video and some climax is going on.
Even I thought so. After because such a long period, I don't know.
You know what's funny? I was also speculating that, and I started looking at his eyes to see if there was any in the reflection in his eyes,
Yeah.
and I didn't see any. Sorry, go on, Vedant.
That's it. Or either he's like trying to observe something with very high focus or something like that. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I guess a big appreciation to both of you because you seem to have very focused minds. I'll just share my list. Well, I'll share the screen as well. So in order of appearance in my head was what's up with the shirt? Followed by, did the video stop buffering? Is he okay? And then there's no sheet on his mattress. Is he going to do something? And then the last thought was, I was thinking about my dinner and how tasty it was. So the idea is that in the span of that 1.5 minutes where we watched a gentleman just stare, that our minds went into so many different places. Like what I was hearing from you, Vaishali and Vedant, was, a lot of speculation about, oh, what's going on? Did something happen? Let me see, maybe he's watching, just trying to deduce. And so the mind is racing. So that's the nature of the mind, that it's always jumping and jumping and jumping with different thoughts, different ideas. And so when we're saying taming the mind before it devours you or us individually, it's about learning to calm the mind and just focus. And we'll talk about, devour is a very strong word, and we'll talk about how it truly can devour us if we don't properly learn to control or regulate the mind. So why should we tame the mind in general? A tame mind is not to be confused with a boring mind. A tame mind makes us more resilient, more focused on our goals. It allows us to focus on things that make us happy in the long term. It also helps to induce a sense of peace. It removes the nagging doubts that can persist and even cripple us. That self-talk of like, you're not good enough. Oh, you don't deserve this. Or, just things where we become our own worst enemy of, things like I shouldn't apply for that college program or that job because I'm really underqualified. And so I just know that I'm setting myself up for defeat. Like we're the ones telling ourselves no before anybody else does. So that's what the untamed mind can do. It holds us back and distracts us. So to look at this, if we're calling the frenemy within, one of the first things to understand in order to deal with the frenemy is understand, what is this frenemy? What is the mind? The mind is the center of the senses. So it's the processor, think of it as like a hub and spoke. It's the processor of the external inputs by our 5 senses. The mind is sometimes called the 6th sense because it's kind of where everything gets consolidated and understood from the perspective of, is this sensory input painful or pleasurable? I may be looking at a very beautiful flower and my mind interprets that as, oh, what the eyes have delivered to me are very beautiful, very pleasing. I like to look at it. My nose picks up the flower and anticipates, oh, this is also going to be very nice. But some flowers don't smell nice. And so when that sensory input goes in, the mind can either make the determination, yes, I want to do this again, or no, I'm not going to try and smell this kind of flower anymore. Let me take a good look at it to make sure I don't make that mistake again. So it's always about accepting and rejecting. This is pleasurable, this is not pleasurable. this is something that will give me a gain. This is something that will give me a loss. This is something that will cause me happiness. This is something that will take away from my happiness, leave me in a condition of distress, fear, and safety. And we can go on and on with this list of dualities or opposites, conflicting concepts. The mind also shapes and influences our desires. I want to feel a certain way, experience things a certain way. And so the mind creates that demand, that desire of, I like to feel something soft. So let me go and find something soft and touch it. Oh, look, there's a kitten. Let me touch it. It feels nice. And the nature of the mind is it's always looking to the past and the future and once in a while the present to be able to inform our desires, inform how we want to engage our senses to get a certain kind of input. We can think about like how many of us have ever, just hung out with friends and had maybe like a movie night or something, and everyone collectively decides, I want to see a horror film. Now, if we look at the sensation of fear and horror, how many people would actually want to put themselves in a real situation that would induce fear or horror? It's generally not a pleasing emotion. But there's a certain kind of excitement or fun, so there's a certain kind of tickling of the senses when you can engage in that level of vicarious danger, we'll call it, without incurring any real harm, any permanent harm. And so it's kind of this very interesting combination of just how, going back to what we were talking about earlier in Living Life Unfiltered, just how these different influences in our life shape our desires. And that mind is a very strong component in that shape of our desires. And in the mind, just making the journey from past and future. So looking to the past to make that determination, is this, going back to the flower example, going to be a source of joy for me, or is it going to be a source of pain? Let me avoid it or let me gravitate toward it. The future. Well, I have this desire I want to enjoy in a certain way, and so I'm going to try every effort possible to enjoy in a certain way, to experience something that's nice. The present can be very, very important, and we'll talk a lot about this in a bit, because being present is extremely important in being able to tame the mind. And the mind devouring us is when the mind gravitates more toward the past and future, living in these concepts, but not really being attuned with the present situation. So we'll also look at the mind from the context of a bodily component hierarchy. So what the stuff that we're made of, both physical as well as stuff that's a little more subtle. So there's my physical body, which provides the mechanics for these senses to operate. I have hands that are specifically used to touch, to engage with different objects, like I'm holding this glass of water. And in the act of the skin touching this glass of water, it feels slightly cool. Depending on how I move it, there's a slight motion associated with it that I'm perceiving through the skin. And it's cooperating with the mind because I'm feeling a little bit thirsty. And I know that if I move my physical body in this way, my mind is going to feel satisfied because the water will be pleasing to my to quenching my thirst. Just an illustration. And so that brain processes this object observed by the senses of my eyes. I see this glass of water. I can hear it, though that's not really critical for this. And the sense of touch, if I couldn't touch and perceive this through my sense of touch, I would not be able to properly hold it, at least not without a lot of training, of just guided by eyesight of like, okay, is my hand properly fitting around this cup, and is it strong enough a grip for me to hold it up? And the intelligence determines what action to take based on how the brain processes it. I see this glass of water. I know that it will be satisfying to my sense of thirst. And intelligence says, okay, you want some water? That's what the body needs right now. Go get some water. It's over here in this bottle, and you can pour it in the cup and drink it. And above the physical body, the senses, which work through the body, and the intelligence, which helps to achieve the ends of the desires of the senses, is the soul, that thing that we talk about that's eternal, that's full of knowledge, and it's full of happiness. The animating force in the body, what gives life, the difference between the living body and the dead body. And so understanding that it starts out in the physical body, the sensory input feeding into the brain, and the intelligence to determine what action to take based on how the brain processes it. It's very much, many times, living life from a bottom-up approach. I am taking certain steps, have certain aspirations or desires, which we talked about earlier, in mind to be able to experience some kind of pleasure through my senses. Now, when we talk about these differences of pleasure and pain or any other kinds of dualities, we don't always act in a way that necessarily, perhaps long-term or even short-term, might bring us happiness or pleasure. And I'm just curious if either of you would be willing to share a time where you really wanted something, but knew it wasn't good for you. And what did you do about it? So I guess one thing that that I'm happy to share is, so I can remember one time in college where I had a lab due for a class, and I really I was at the time at a business plan competition, so there was no way I would have the time to be able to complete the lab by the assigned deadline. And I emailed my professor. He wasn't willing to give an extension. And so I was thinking, what can I do to have a legitimate reason to turn this in late so that I can do it once the competition is over and not get penalized? And so my mind started scheming, thinking, okay, maybe I can find a way. So I started Googling ways to intentionally corrupt a file. Then I couldn't find a satisfactory way to do it. And so I called my friend. And at the time of doing this, I knew that this was definitely not my best self, and that long-term it wasn't good for me, because if it was discovered, there would be some ramifications. And I also generally don't do that kind of thing. So I wasn't very proud of myself for even going down that path. But the nature of the mind is that that was the only way out that I saw. It never occurred to me, just suck it up and turn in what you've got. And so I called my friend, who was pretty good with computers, and I had asked him, hey, do you know how to intentionally corrupt a file? And luckily he was very blunt with me. He said, wow, that's pretty low. And I was like, whoa, that was, I guess, just the wake-up call that I needed, because I gave up any ideas of intentionally corrupting the file and I just turned in what I got. And funny enough, I ended up getting a 95 on it with just what I had done. So it wasn't that bad. And so I really wanted to kind of take the escapist way out, knowing that it wasn't good for me long-term. And luckily, I got that reality check. And so I felt really good about it afterwards. Like, even if it wasn't a 95, if it was less, I still would feel glad that I made that decision and keep, at least from an action perspective, a sense of integrity. But I don't know if you have experiences like that where you were going down a path and maybe you did go down a path that wasn't good for you, or just like you had that inner voice saying, no, 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 no. And then another inner voice saying, yeah, but da, 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 da. Like, do you have those experiences?
Yeah, like initially in my undergrad or something, like on exams, I remember we used to discuss. So, like we always have that inner voice, right? Telling you this is not right, this is not right. And it's not me directly, but my friend got like big punishment out of that. And I saw that, and then I realized, like, okay, this is not a good thing. I think in school, some days in school or in some diploma, I think.
Mm.
So that was like, okay, only once I did, and just like I was realized, no, 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 I should not repeat these kinds of things. And anyway, it's not that satisfying. Even if we do, I think after doing that things, we know that it's wrong. Of course, we always know that it's wrong. And then it's always, even if you get, I think, good marks, you don't feel like satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
These kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's true, because by nature, the hierarchy of activity is our the soul is meant to be the controller of this body, and the soul is meant to guide the intelligence, which guides the mind and the senses to support the soul.
Hmm.
And that's a satisfying position. Where we feel dissatisfied is when the hierarchy is completely flipped over. It's like a reflection in the water, where the senses are dragging, which is dragging the intelligence, which is dragging the soul. One way that, just to go into these competing voices in our heads, and these are, I guess, the socially acceptable kind of voices in our heads of you should do it, or don't do it, is it's sometimes described as the parent, meaning our higher self or higher capacity to think, process, respond, and the unruly child, which is completely guided by the senses. I have two kids, so I can speak to this, and if, I'm sure you've seen in stores, they've gone out, the tantrums. Maybe there's a toddler on the floor in the store crying and screaming, and because something interrupted their pleasure they were getting out of their senses. I want this candy. I anticipate getting happiness from this candy. If you don't support my getting happiness from this candy, all of my alarms are just going to freak out, and I'm going to collapse to the floor and scream at the top of my lungs like I'm being murdered. That's the child mentality. Now let's contrast that with an adult. Let's say, Vedant, you study really hard for an exam, and you sincerely try your best. You get an 85 instead of the 95 you were hoping for. Are you going to collapse on the floor and start screaming at the top of your lungs?
Not really.
And if the answer is yes, no judgments. But but yeah, there's a certain level of intelligence or rationale, the ability to process and respond, rather than just my plans were disturbed or destroyed, so my whole world has collapsed. And so with the, let's say, a child having a meltdown, what is the role of a parent in that meltdown? Like, what are some ways that a parent could respond to an unruly child, to a child during a tantrum? What are some things the parent could do? And we might have to dig to our own experiences when we were the unruly child for that, but But what are some things parents would do?
Shout.
They could shout, yeah. They could try to outshout a toddler, but I'd say good luck to that. What are some other things the parents could do?
Divert to
Okay,
another.
divert the attention.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the parent could throw another tantrum themselves. They could divert the child's attention. They could just think, I don't have the mental space to deal with this. I'm just going to give them what they want and save the battle for them.
Yeah.
They could just give in. And, all of them are ways to respond. And we can also look at that as our mind. Somebody says something insulting. We could choose, I'm going to out insult them, and then this war of words ensues. Or, to draw the parallel of diverting, they could insult and we could say, I don't appreciate that, but let's understand why you're doing that. And then the give in is like, you know what, you're not worth my time, I'm walking away. Or just not even acknowledging it, pretending like it's not even there. So we can draw these parallels of that simple example of the unruly child with really how we process things that might cause a disturbance to our mind, whether it's a good kind of disturbance, like, oh my gosh, I just got a full scholarship and my mind is racing with all this excitement and these plans, or the opposite, something that we valued very much, that we're very attached to, just got taken away from us. And sometimes these things that might agitate our minds, they might be considered reasonable by most common standards, and other times they're unreasonable. An example I was reading about is, it was talking about parents posting pictures of their children on social media. And the article really hit hard on one particular post where a mother posted a video of her toddler who had a complete meltdown, and she posted on social media because the toddler was upset, like in bawling in tears, because he was so disturbed that water made him wet. Now the parent in us says, okay, what do you expect? The nature of water is liquidity. Like it's gonna make you wet. But to that toddler, like that was the end of the world, and that they somehow couldn't separate, or that they couldn't see that intrinsic quality of water. And so they felt betrayed by what their expectation was of trying to enjoy with water versus the reality. I don't like to get wet. So sometimes these things that are causing a disturbance to our mind may be reasonable or unreasonable, but they exist. And so we acknowledge it. And part of that ability for the mind to devour us is to take us on a whole train of thought and just collapse our entire worldview and outlook. Something that we've mentioned a few times about that short-term view of the mind. So going back to the story of that lab and my single-minded focus to try to cheat my way into getting an extension. Anyway, there was no guarantee he would give me an extension even if I did cheat my way, but that's a whole other thing. The mind saw that as the singular important thing. All other options were just not even on the radar. Like it, to my friend's credit, it never even occurred to me just to turn it in as it is. That's how blinding the mind can be. And that's an example of the mind on a total runaway 3-year-old tantrum. So that's an example of the mind devouring me because it took me away from principles that I generally hold. And it was allowing me to pursue a course of action that would ultimately not be in my best interest. And so that's what I mean when I'm saying about the mind devouring, that the mind should become our friend rather than our enemy, to help us to move toward things that actually bring us joy, allow us to see our full potential. And the interesting thing about this parent and unruly child example is, at the end of the day, it's just a limited example because the parent is his or her own individual and the child is its own individual. But when we're talking about it in the context of the sense of I, me as soul, and the mind, we occupy the same body. So there's no concept of I'm going to ignore you, like, just pretend you're not there, or timeouts or punishments. We're stuck together. And so the mind is always trying to, because the mind, the uncontrolled mind, the mind that's in the position to devour me, is always trying to serve the senses, that upside down hierarchy. And so what does life look like if my mind is singularly focused on generating as much sensory input as possible? What does life look like when the senses drive our experience in the world? And maybe some examples are the temptation of the senses, like, oh, I've worked hard enough. I deserve this break. I just want to take it easy right now. Or let's say I have some lofty goal and I'm making sincere progress. The uncontrolled mind, the mind trying to devour me, might say, well, maybe it's not all it's cracked up to be. Let's find something else to do that's easier. Let's go get drunk. Let's fill in the blank. Let's escape with something. So it's the mind discouraging us, taking us away from the things that we, in a moment of sobriety, decide that actually is in our best interest, and the mind can take us away from those things that are in our best interest. And so the mind, the uncontrolled mind, the mind that's out to devour me, is all about short-term, what feels good. It's impulsive, it's distracted. You may have heard stories about people who make millions of dollars only to lose it in the span of a year or even a few months, because the addiction, the pleasure that they got from just spending and spending and spending and consuming was so strong that it became blinding to the point that it's all gone. There was no kind of sobriety associated with understanding I've got to make sure that this is sustainable, whatever it is I'm doing, as kind of a basic element. And so how is it possible that the mind can just take over like this? Like, because it's one thing I do as a bit of an exercise sometimes to separate myself from a situation is, I just remember I had this fantastic marketing professor at IIT named Susan Moeller. And she was really, really good about just presenting like business cases, business situations, always with a marketing perspective. And the solutions always seemed so obvious when they were written down in front of me. And so at some point it occurred to me, whenever I have challenges or big decisions, to look at them in the same way as something written down on a piece of paper. If I were to look at a situation I'm facing in third person, for example, how would I, not as me, but as that third person observer, think to respond to that situation? And it's usually a very different outcome than when I'm in the heat of that moment, in the heat of that either trial or source of potential happiness or whatever it might be. Because in the first person, I'm identifying with that situation. And so I become consumed with all these factors, and maybe even the factors aren't given their proper weight. So I'm just reacting to whatever comes, but not really thinking it through in a full way. Versus I try to detach myself from that situation and am able to see the factors more clearly and understand how much weight each factor should be given, and what course of action will most likely lead to a favorable outcome that's aligned with my values, my goals, etc. So that's the difference between a devoured mind and a tamed mind. How good are we at stepping away from identifying with that mind as the slave of the senses? Now, another comparison that's sometimes given in Vedic literature is that the mind is considered to be like the charioteer, and pulled by 5 horses, which are the senses. And so all of us have seen what like horse-drawn carts look like, right? Or like a team of horses. So when they're tame, when the horses are properly controlled by the charioteer says go left, the horses go left. When he says go right, when they go right. When he says stop, they stop. When he says go forward, they go forward. But what happens if the charioteer is either inexperienced or lazy or just loses control for whatever reason? And just to give a sense of like, well, this is actually no joke, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me a second. Okay, you can see my screen?
Yes.
So these horses got scared by a loud noise. The passengers get thrown, some benches get destroyed. There's a big body of water. Luckily, the horses haven't jumped in there.
We need someone from their office to come down here right away and help out.
Okay. So you get the idea. So what is the danger in having senses gone wild? Like what happens? What happened when those horses started to get scared and run all over the place?
And they can harm or destroy, destruction.
Mm. Yeah. And if we compare runaway senses or runaway horses to the senses, and if you're saying runaway horses can cause harm or destruction to themselves, because those horses probably at least got some scratches at the very least through those benches and all that, they were a serious hazard to others. So if we're saying runaway horses are a damage to themselves and others, what about runaway senses? Is that also a damage, or is that running a risk of damage to ourselves and others?
Yes.
How? How can runaway senses cause damage to, let's break it down. How can runaway senses cause damage to myself?
Just like, for example, a person who went into a big trauma, and instead of coming out of it, he decided to go in more into it. So he may end up in doing suicide or getting drunk and all. That's kind of senses are pulling to the other way to the negativity than positivity.
Yeah, make the pain go away. The mind is experiencing pain, so let me engage the senses to dull the pain. Yeah. And what about to others? How can runaway senses cause harm to others? Well, one example, a few examples, slaughterhouses. I really want to eat meat. And to satisfy my tongue, my desire to eat meat, billions of cows and chickens and other animals are slaughtered every year. Like when I tell some of my friends that I'm vegetarian, I get a few reactions. One is, wow. Another is, oh, I couldn't do that. I love meat so much. Another is, I tried it, but I just couldn't do it because I couldn't get away from the taste. And so for me to get a moment's pleasure on my tongue, all those animals have to die. Or we could even look at just the technology that we use in our everyday lives, like this laptop that I'm talking through and using as a tool. There's thousands of components in it, some materials that are very difficult to extract and very difficult and pollution intensive to process. So I know for a fact that somewhere in the world, somebody has poisoned water so that I can have my laptop, or I can have the latest phone, or whatever it might be. So to satisfy my senses, my perceived needs, somebody else is suffering. So what is the goal then of taming the mind? Is it to make it zero, to not have desires? Because it seems like desire is the source of all these different problems. Is that the goal? What do you think?
No. We cannot have empty mind.
Yeah, just try it. Like the video we saw at the beginning. My gosh. that guy.
Not possible.
And you know what's amazing? That video is over 2 hours long. So yeah, that's quite an exercise. Like, you know, just try to quiet the mind, quiet desires, even for 10 seconds. And just because it's tough doesn't mean it's impossible, but the nature of the soul is there is activity. And that we exhibit these desires, emotions, that we do things. The soul by nature is active, and so the way it expresses itself in the body is also meant to be active. And in the Bhagavad Gita, one of our main texts, Krishna says, one must deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. And then the next verse uses goes even stronger in saying, for him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends. So not just get some help from it, but conquering the mind means the mind is the best of friends. So it will be there, your servant 100%. But one who has failed to conquer the mind, one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy. So that frenemy, that person that's always smiling but ready to stab you behind your back. And one thing that I wanted to share, it's one of my favorite dramas. It's called The Gita Concise. It's put together by this monk, Bhakti Marg Swami. And he takes the whole Bhagavad Gita and summarizes it in a really nice 25-minute drama. And there's a nice scene just showing the process of conquering the mind and just the nature of the mind. So it's a little humorous. I hope you like it. So give me a second. Okay, you can see?
Yes.
Still struggling? Everyone is struggling with the 5 senses and with the 6th sense.
The mind?
And here it is. The mind is the center of the senses.
Yes!
But it is below the intelligence.
No!
Control the lower self by the higher self.
Maybe?
Divert this mind to superior thoughts. Engage it in doing good for others. Now, let's try to control it.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. Here we go. Oh, yes, 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 yes. Oh, yes, 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 yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh, uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
You do want to be peaceful, don't you, Arjun? Yes? No? Maybe?
You say I
All right. So it's a bit a humorous presentation of the mind and how it relates to us as individuals. But at the same time, you can see there's a clear contrast between in the beginning, where the mind personified was just literally everywhere and just unfocused and switching from the highs and lows and not really doing anybody any good, honestly. But it was when that mind was able to be subservient within the proper structure that it could be used for constructive purposes. And so that's kind of the turning point. So how do we tame the mind? In short, we train it. And it always starts with a decision. I don't necessarily know how I'm going to train the mind, how I'm going to calm it down, but I want to do it. So there needs to be that innate commitment to having the mind as my servant rather than as my master, my controller. And part of that comes down to just calming the senses to calm the mind. One example could be have any of you ever gone down the YouTube rabbit hole where you start out by looking for one thing and then 2 hours later you realize, why am I looking at, videos of 20 kittens playing with balls in a cafe in Japan? Or, have you ever had that experience? Well, I have. And I can tell you that that's an example of the runaway mind. And so when I'm exposing myself to so much sensory input, then the mind is just kind of distracted. It's not focused on where it needs to be. Or how many of you have had that instance where you think, let me just check on Instagram or my friend's Facebook status or whatever it might be. And you suddenly see something that disturbs you, like, oh, this person told me they were gonna be here but couldn't go because of some problem, and suddenly I see them on the beach, with hanging out with their other friends, and so all these then emotions start to come into play, just from a seemingly simple or innocent act of checking social media. And so it's kind of like our sensory input being fired on all cylinders all the time. And so a big part of taming the mind is just learning how to, through that decision of, I don't necessarily know how, but I'm going to do it, making a decision to regulate my sensory input. So it might be, okay, I really like social media. I personally don't, but I'm just speaking hypothetically. So let me at least regulate, okay, from this time to this time, I'm going to do it. Or I'm a compulsive email checker. Well, let me just only check it once every half an hour, or once every hour, or once every 15 minutes, or wherever you are. Just take one step forward to make it a little more regulated. Because then you'll see, as soon as you start saying to the mind, no, you're going to do what I say, it's not time for that. It's like the responsible parent dealing with an unruly child, setting boundaries, setting up a system so that we're not negating the senses, we're not negating the role of the mind, but we're putting it in its proper place. If we see the senses as paths to the mind, then conversely, we can also see the, let's say, higher understanding, that soul driving the intelligence, driving the mind. So we can also see that as a path to the mind. A really important piece to calming the senses, to calm the mind, is to not set ourselves up for failure. If, for example, I'll just use an comparison of, there's a recovering alcoholic, somebody who's addicted to consuming a lot of alcohol, and they make a commitment, I'm not going to do this anymore. But to get home from their support meetings every week, they have to pass by their favorite bar. Do you think this person's going to succeed in their attempt to get away from being consumed by alcohol? Probably not, because that stimulus, that impetus to give into that, let's say, lower desire, that uncontrolled mind and senses, to want to enjoy in that particular way, which is not long-term beneficial, is going to be triggered. It's going to be reminded, especially when that higher idea of I want to regulate, I want to put myself in a long-term favorable direction, is weak. Now, there's an example sometimes used that inside each of us, there are two wolves that are constantly competing for attention. There's the good wolf and the bad wolf. And whichever one we give into in any situation is driven by which one barks the loudest. If it's, let's say, the lower self, the bad wolf, we'll call it, that barks louder, then chances are I'm going to give into that voice. And if it's the good one that's barking louder, chances are I'm going to give into that one to influence my decision. But what governs how loudly the good or the bad wolf barks? It's whichever one we feed. So if we make one side weak and the other one strong, chances are that's the one we're going to give into. So a large part of taming the mind is starving ourselves of the things that cause us to make short-term decisions that are about instant gratification, that are encouraging us to do things that maybe aren't in our best interest, that plague us with doubt, that prevent us, that get in the way of us being our very best selves. And so to go back to that example of the recovering alcoholic who walks by their favorite bar every week when they come home from their meetings, instead of setting themselves up for failure in that way, there could be that moment of realization. If I go here, I know that I will be triggered. And by repeating this action that I'm trying to break away from, I'm going to just make this that much harder and just feed the bad wolf. So let me find a different route home where I don't pass my favorite bar. And in that way, I can become stronger so that one day maybe I can take that quicker way home. The other thing to consider is cultivating that inner calm. So we're calming down the senses, and as a result, calming down the mind. So it's not that constant input, vying for attention, seeking this and that. It's also about that inner calm. And that's why the meditation practice that we talked about last week becomes so important. One thing that was mentioned, and I'll repeat again, that this mantra meditation, the chanting of Hare Krishna, is described as the process that cleanses the mirror of the mind. So why is the mind many times the slave of the senses? Because the mind that is intended to be subordinate to the intelligence is weak. The senses have become strengthened by constantly feeding them, by constantly giving into it. And so this mantra meditation offers an opportunity to regulate the mind, regulate the senses. Because one thing that we experience with mantra meditation is the mind starts to rebel a little bit like an obstinate child. Like sometimes when I put my hands on my beads to chant my meditation beads, I suddenly get all these thoughts and ideas, and the mind tries to go here and there and here and there. It's kind of like a dog on a leash that's trying to break free. And as soon as I take my hands off of the meditation beads, the ideas just disappear, because now the mind feels safe, like, okay, you know, that competition for supremacy is temporarily subdued. And so the more that we identify with that higher self, the more that we engage in this process of meditation to cleanse the mirror of the mind, the more the mind will be aligned with that higher desire, so that we can start to cultivate transcendental values, spiritual values that understand that this life is not just meant to maximize how good I can experience the world through my senses, the most luxurious settings that I can lay my eyes on, the softest, most refined cloth that I can touch with my hands, the nicest, most exotic, flavorful foods that my tongue can taste. Those things may come or they may not come. But part of taming the mind is understanding that is not the goal of life. The goal of life is not to have those highest sensory experiences. Rather, the highest experience really is the one that comes from within, that we can realize through this process of meditation by having our body structure hierarchy in its proper order. And the thing to keep us on this path is regularly checking in, knowing where I'm going and why. The uncontrolled senses mean, oh yeah, I want to go to New York City, that sounds nice. But just based on a series of detours just being dragged by my mind and senses, I may end up in Kamchatka and never actually get to New York. And I wouldn't even realize it until I was like, oh, I have no idea where I am. And this is not New York. Versus the direct route. There may be things that would try to vie for my attention or distract me, but I know that my goal is to get to New York City, and so I'm going to go there directly. And so where we're going, that destination, so knowing where we're going becomes a guide to hold decisions toward. My mind and senses want to experience this, but does it get me closer to my goal or not? And then understanding why will keep us committed to that path of action. We'll continue to care about achieving that destination or goal. It provides the incentive or focus. And the nice thing is, this mantra meditation, one of the side effects of it is it strengthens that clarity and resolve so that we are less susceptible to these distractions of the mind. One thing we saw in a video, in the video last week on mantra meditation, or in meditation in general, is that the act of meditating causes us to become less distracted in general. That's just a side effect of it. And when we do get distracted, it is easier for us to recognize I am getting distracted and then hit the reset button to go back to what I want to focus on. And so the intention is taking this frenemy of the mind that's within us, taming it, and making it just a friend, the best of friends, and as what Bhagavad Gita is saying, rather than the worst or greatest enemy that's inside us. So just wanted to see if you had any other comments or thoughts that you'd like to add. Okay. Vedant, you want to?
Yeah, there is one very interesting story I heard about mind, how it works. Can I just share it?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's like a two person. They're walking on a street, and they see a bank ahead in front of them. So the other person, he says to the first person, "Oh, just go. We'll just go inside and loot the bank, and we'll be very rich. And I have complete plan about how we can loot the bank, and nobody will come to know."
Mm-hmm.
So first person says, "Okay, let me think." Then the second person again forces him. He tries to, dominate him. Then he agrees to the plan. Then they goes for a bank looting, and when they go, like alarms goes on, and the police comes, and And at the end, what happens? The second person, he somehow runs away. And the first person he gets caught. So when police get him, then on the next day, in the court, there is hearing about the scenario happened yesterday.
Mhm.
So very interestingly, when he goes to the court, when he enters the court, he sees the other person who was with him for looting the bank. He's sitting as a judge inside the court. So it's like a mind. Mind is only impelling us to do things, and later on, mind is only telling why did you do that thing.
Nice.
Wow, that's a great example. Thank you for sharing that, Vedant. All right, I guess if there's nothing else, we'll end there. Thank you so much, and we will continue next week.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
bye. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.